When my son told me he was getting married, I thought I'd finally have the daughter I never had. I helped with the plans, smiled through every phone call, even paid for the venue quietly, of course. Mothers do that. We give. We stay in the background. But a week before the wedding, my soon-to-be daughter-in-law called. Her voice was smooth as glass. "Grace," she said, "we'd rather you didn't come. This is our day. No drama, no distractions, no distractions." That's what she called me. I hung up my hands, shaking my heart breaking, and I decided I wouldn't say a word. Not one. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than shouting. And on the wedding day, when the planner took the microphone to thank the person who paid for the stunning oceanfront venue, every head turned. My daughter-in-law's smile froze mid-pose. What happened next silenced the room and changed the way my son looked at her forever. Keep listening, because this isn't just a story about a wedding gone wrong. It's about what happens when kindness becomes someone's greatest revenge. My name is Grace Whitman. I'm 63 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who still wakes up at 6 every morning out of habit. After my husband passed away 8 years ago, I found comfort in small, quiet things: my garden, a cup of coffee before sunrise, the slow hum of the radio in the kitchen. I live alone in a little white house at the edge of town, the kind with creaky floors and rose bushes that have outlived most of my neighbors. My world isn't big anymore, but it's mine, peaceful, steady, and filled with things that don't talk back. That morning began like any other. The sun had just climbed over the maple trees, and I was outside with my watering can, whispering encouragement to my lilies as though they were old friends. "You're doing better than I am these days," I said, laughing softly at myself. It's funny how a woman alone starts to talk to flowers. They're better listeners than most people, and they don't interrupt. The air smelled of earth and fresh rain, the kind of scent that makes you remember summers when your knees didn't ache and your heart didn't feel so tired. Then my phone rang, startling me. It was Daniel, my only son. I wiped my hands on my apron before answering, smiling automatically at the sound of his voice. "Hey, Mom," he said, cheerful, but rushed like always. "How's my favorite gardener?" "Still trying to keep things alive," I teased. "It's harder than it looks, you know." He chuckled. That laugh has always sounded like his father's. "Listen," he continued. "I was wondering if I could bring someone by for dinner tonight." My heart lifted. "Someone?" "Her name's Chloe," he said. "We've been seeing each other for a while. I think you'll like her." I leaned against the porch railing, feeling a small flutter in my chest. It had been years since Daniel had brought anyone home. He'd had girlfriends, sure, but none he thought important enough to meet me. Of course, I said quickly, trying not to sound too eager. "What time?" "Around 6, if that's okay. Don't go crazy with dinner, Mom. Crazy." I pretended to be offended. "I'll just roast a chicken. Maybe make some of those mashed potatoes you love." He groaned playfully. "I knew you would." "Okay, 6 o'clock. Thanks, Mom." When he hung up, I stood there for a long moment, phone in hand, staring out at the rows of flowers bending gently in the breeze. My boy was bringing someone home. Someone serious from the sound of it. I felt the quiet thrill of possibility, the kind you don't get often when your days are more routine than adventure. The house suddenly felt too small, too dusty, too old. I went inside, tying my apron a little tighter, and began the whirlwind that always takes over when a mother wants everything to be perfect. I opened windows to let in the spring air, changed the tablecloth to the one with embroidered daisies, and took down the good china. The plates I only use when I want to feel like life still has special occasions left in it. The kitchen came alive again. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air as I seasoned the chicken, humming an old song that used to make my husband dance me around the kitchen. I could almost hear him laughing, telling me I was fussing too much. "It's not every day your son brings home the future," I said aloud, smiling. The cat jumped onto the counter, meowing as if agreeing. "Don't you start," I told him. "You're not allowed on the table tonight. We need to look civilized." The day moved slowly in that pleasant, expectant way. I ironed a blouse, polished the silverware, and arranged fresh roses from the garden in a crystal vase. I even caught myself checking the mirror more than once. My hair had gone mostly silver, now gracefully gray, my neighbor Helen called it, but I added a touch of lipstick anyway. I didn't want to look like a lonely widow tonight. I wanted to look like the kind of mother a young woman might like. By 5:30, everything was ready. The table gleamed, the candles were set, and the smell of baked apples drifted through the house. I stood at the window waiting, trying not to feel nervous. "It's silly," I told myself. "She's just a girl." But my heart didn't listen. I wanted her to see the best of me, the best of this home, the home that built the man she was about to meet in a new way. At exactly 6, Daniel's car pulled into the driveway. I watched through the curtain as he got out, tall and handsome, in a navy jacket that made him look every bit the grown man he'd become. Then she stepped out from the passenger side. Chloe. Even from that distance, I could tell she was stunning, tall, slim, with hair that fell like silk over her shoulders, dressed in the kind of beige coat that costs more than my entire wardrobe. I smoothed my apron and took a deep breath. My pulse quickened with both pride and a hint of worry. Beautiful girls can be wonderful. They can also be dangerous. As they walked to the door, I caught sight of Daniel, reaching for her hand, his face lit with a smile I hadn't seen in years. That's when it hit me. She mattered to him, really mattered. The knock came soft but confident. "Coming," I called, wiping my hands. I opened the door, smiling as warmly as I could. "Welcome, sweetheart," I said to her. She smiled back, perfectly, polite, perfectly poised, but something in that smile felt practiced, like she'd done this many times before. Her perfume floated through the doorway, delicate and expensive. "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Whitman," she said. Her voice was smooth, refined, every word deliberate. "Please call me Grace," I replied, stepping aside. "And thank you for coming. I've heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope," she said, glancing around the living room as she walked in. Her eyes moved over the photographs, the crocheted pillows, the mismatched furniture, a quick assessing look that made me suddenly aware of every flaw. Daniel kissed my cheek. "Smells amazing, Mom. Just chicken and mashed potatoes," I said, brushing his arm. "Your favorite?" I turned back to Chloe, trying again. "I hope you like apple pie." "I don't usually eat dessert," she said politely. "But it smells lovely," I nodded, smiling, pretending not to feel the small sting of that remark. Dinner began with laughter, mostly Daniel's. He tried so hard to fill the silence between us. I talked about my garden, my students, the town fair last summer. Chloe nodded, smiled, and complimented the flowers on the table. "You grew these?" she asked. "Everyone," I said proudly. "They bloom even when nothing else wants to." "How nice," she murmured, taking a sip of wine. "My mother hates gardening. She says it ruins your nails." I smiled again, though something inside me wilted just a little. The evening went on. Chloe was polite, graceful, perfectly pleasant, but there was a distance in her eyes, like she was already somewhere else. I tried not to notice. Mothers learn to hope in quiet ways. After they left, I stood at the window watching their car disappear down the street, the sound of laughter fading into the night. I turned off the lights one by one, the house falling back into its comfortable silence. And as I rinsed the dishes, I caught myself whispering her name. Chloe. Her name was Chloe, and somehow that name already sounded expensive. It's funny how a single name can leave a taste in your mouth before you even meet the person who wears it. That night, after Daniel's call, I went to bed, thinking about that name, wondering what kind of woman it belonged to. The next afternoon, the house smelled of cinnamon and roasted apples, and I was trying not to look like someone who had cleaned for 6 straight hours. My son was bringing home the woman who might someday be my daughter-in-law, and though I told myself to be calm, my heart had been restless all day, fluttering like a trapped bird. I had set the table early, polished the silverware until it gleamed, and even brought out the pie I'd baked that morning, my late husband's favorite recipe. By the time Daniel's car rolled into the driveway, I'd already smoothed the tablecloth 3 times and told the cat to stay off the furniture at least 5. When the doorbell rang, I wiped my hands on my apron and tried to steady my voice. Coming, I called, though it sounded breathless. I opened the door, and there she was, Chloe. Everything about her seemed deliberate. The perfect shade of beige coat hair, so sleek, it looked like it would slip through your fingers' shoes that had never known a muddy driveway. She smiled a small polished smile and extended a manicured hand. "Mrs. Whitman," she said smoothly. "It's so lovely to meet you. Please call me Grace," I replied, shaking her hand. "Come in before you catch cold." Daniel stepped forward to hug me. "Smells amazing, Mom," he said, grinning like the boy he used to be. That grin always melted me. "Just apple pie and roasted chicken," I said. "Nothing fancy." Then I turned to close the door and froze. There, perched squarely in the middle of the dining table, tail curled proudly around the apple pie, sat my cat, Oliver. His paw was dangerously close to the crust, and he looked very pleased with himself. "Oh, for heaven's sake," I muttered, hurrying forward. "Oliver." "What did I tell you?" Chloe stopped in the doorway, one hand still on her purse, her eyes wide. Is that the dessert?" she asked, her tone a mix of horror and disbelief. I scooped Oliver into my arms before he could take a victory bite and said lightly, "He's just checking the crust. Quality control, you know." Daniel burst out laughing, and for a moment the tension broke. "Mom, you and that cat," he said, shaking his head. But Chloe didn't laugh. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile you give when you're not sure if something's meant to be funny or sad. "Well," she said, after a pause, "at least he has good taste." I placed Oliver on the floor, wiped the table with a damp towel, and pretended not to notice how Chloe subtly stepped back, clutching her handbag a little tighter. "I'm so sorry," I said, forcing cheer into my voice. "He thinks he runs the house." "Cats usually do," she replied, her voice polite, but distant. She looked around, her gaze moving over the family photos on the mantel, the crocheted doilies, the floral wallpaper that had been there since before Daniel was born. "It's very—" She hesitated, as if searching for a word that wouldn't offend. "Nostalgic." I smiled, even though I felt something inside me sink a little. Nostalgic. Not charming, not cozy nostalgic, as if my home were a museum exhibit. "Yes," I said, setting down a tray of glasses. "It's been this way for years. I suppose I like things that remember where they came from." She nodded, glancing toward Daniel, who quickly jumped in to change the subject. "Mom's always kept the place spotless," he said. "She won't even let me sit down without checking my shoes." "That's not true," I said automatically. But he grinned. "It's true." We moved to the dining table. The candles flickered. The chicken smelled perfect. And for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, things would feel natural. I carved the meat and passed the plates. Chloe thanked me with a gracious nod, but she ate delicately, cutting each bite, as if afraid of getting grease on her fingers. Daniel filled the silence with stories from work, and I laughed in all the right places. Still, every time I looked at her, I felt like my old house shrank a little under her gaze. She wasn't cruel. She was simply the kind of person who made you notice the distance between her world and yours. Halfway through dinner, Oliver reappeared, slipping quietly under the table. I felt his fur brush my ankles, and I smiled down at him. Chloe noticed. "You let him wander freely in the kitchen?" she asked. "Oh, yes," I said. "He's family." She tilted her head slightly. "I see." Then, as if realizing she might sound judgmental, she added, "That's sweet." Daniel laughed again, the sound too loud, too forced. "Mom's house is basically a cat cafe," he said. I saw the look Chloe gave him, small, polite, but enough to make him stop in mid-sentence. For a moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the tick of the old wall clock, steady and a little too loud. I poured more wine, trying to fill the silence. "So, Chloe," I said gently, "where did you grow up?" "Chicago," she replied. "Well, technically the suburbs." "Beautiful city," I said. "My husband used to take us there for the winter markets." "It's changed a lot," she said with a soft sigh. "I don't really miss it." "But you must have family there still?" I asked. She paused, her fork hovering above her plate. "We're not very close," she said simply. Something in her tone told me not to ask more, so I didn't. Instead, I offered dessert. Chloe smiled politely again. "I don't usually eat sweets," she said, "but thank you." "That's all right," I said. "More for us." Daniel grinned, leaning back in his chair. "You've never turned down Mom's pie, Chloe." "You don't know what you're missing." She laughed, a small, careful sound. "I'm sure it's wonderful." After dinner, while Daniel helped me carry dishes to the sink, Chloe wandered toward the living room. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she examined a framed photo of Daniel at age 10, holding his first fishing rod beside his father. She said softly, almost to herself, "You've lived here a long time." "All my life," I said, drying my hands. "Every corner has a story." "I can tell," she murmured. "It's very personal." Her eyes flicked to the crocheted afghan on the couch, to the scuffed floorboards that had seen decades of footsteps. She smiled again, but this time I wasn't sure what it meant. When they left that evening, the air outside had turned cool, and the porch light cast a soft glow around them. I hugged Daniel tight, told him to drive safely, and shook Chloe's hand. "Thank you for coming, dear," I said. "Dinner was lovely," she replied. "Your home is so nostalgic." There it was again, that word. She meant it kindly, I think, but it stayed with me long after the car disappeared down the street. I stood at the doorway, my hand still on the knob, listening to the night settle back into its usual quiet. Daniel laughed, but his eyes silently begged me not to say anything more. I remember that look clearly, even now. It stayed with me in the weeks that followed, a quiet signal I couldn't quite interpret. I wanted to believe it meant he was simply nervous, protective, even wanting the woman he loved and the mother who raised him to get along. Still, it left a small ache. I couldn't shake off, the kind that settles somewhere behind your ribs and waits. Life went on as usual. We spoke on the phone once or twice a week, small talk, mostly. His work, the weather, how Chloe was doing. He seemed happy, and that was all I needed to hear. Then one Sunday afternoon, he called and asked if I'd join them for dinner. "There's something we'd like to tell you," he said, and though he didn't say it outright, I heard the smile in his voice. I didn't need to guess what it was. That evening, I drove into the city for the first time in months. The restaurant was the kind of place where the lighting was soft enough to hide the prices on the menu. I felt slightly out of place in my navy dress, the one I wore to graduations and weddings. When I walked in, I saw them immediately Daniel in a tailored jacket, looking every bit the grown man, and Chloe in a sleek red dress that drew every eye in the room. She waved when she saw me, her smile poised and picture perfect. "Grace," she called out, "you look lovely." I smiled back, touched but uncertain. "Thank you, dear. You too look radiant." I meant it even if the word felt old-fashioned in my mouth. Daniel hugged me, his arm warm around my shoulders. "Glad you could make it, Mom." I sat down across from them, and before I could even pick up the menu, Chloe reached over and said, "We've already ordered the wine. I hope you like Merlot." Her tone was pleasant, but final, as though she were hosting rather than inviting. I nodded, glancing at Daniel, who only smiled a little sheepishly. The waiter came, and before I could speak, Chloe did again. "We'll start with the scallops," she said, "then the sea bass for me and the steak for Daniel." She glanced at me, polite, but brisk. "And for you, Grace," I looked down at the menu, though I'd already decided. "The chicken, please." "Excellent choice," she said, turning the menu toward the waiter with a practiced smile. She'd done this before, taken command of a table without anyone noticing until it was too late. We chatted about their new apartment, her job, his promotion. Chloe spoke in polished sentences, always with the faintest hint of performance, like someone aware of an invisible camera. Every so often, Daniel would start to tell a story about their vacation plans, about work, and she'd interrupt with a soft laugh. "Oh, that's not quite how it happened," she'd say, correcting him gently, touching his hand as if to soften the blow. He didn't seem to mind, but I did. I noticed things like that, the small ways people rearrange each other's sentences. When the main course arrived, I found myself watching them more than eating. They looked good together, I couldn't deny that. He seemed proud of her, as though she were proof he'd done something right with his life. And she was impressive, I'll give her that. She carried herself with the kind of confidence I'd never had at her age. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching my son through a glass window, close enough to see him smile, but too far to touch the world he now lived in. When dessert came, a waiter brought a small cake with a single candle. I looked up, surprised. Chloe grinned, her eyes sparkling. "It's not a birthday," she said, "but it is a celebration." Daniel cleared his throat, suddenly nervous, and took my hand across the table. "Mom," he said, his voice thick, "we wanted you to be the first to know we're engaged." For a moment I couldn't speak. My heart swelled with pride, with love, with something sharp and complicated that I couldn't quite name. I squeezed his hand, blinking away tears. "Oh, Daniel," I said softly, "I'm so happy for you both." Chloe held out her hand, the diamond catching the light like a tiny sun. "He did well, didn't he?" she said with a smile that was both teasing and triumphant. I nodded, still dazed. "It's beautiful," I said. "You'll make a lovely bride." We toasted, laughed, and talked about wedding dates and venues. I smiled through all of it, though my heart felt oddly heavy. As the evening wound down, the waiter quietly set the check on the table. Daniel reached for it, but I was quicker. "I've got it," I said, pulling it toward me. "Mom, no," he began, but I waved him off. "Please, let me. It's a mother's privilege." I handed over my card before he could protest. Chloe watched that same calm smile on her lips, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "That's very generous of you, Grace," she said lightly. "You don't have to." "I know," I replied. "I want to." She smiled when I took the bill, as if generosity was just another habit of mine. I carried that look home with me that night, tucked somewhere between pride and unease. Daniel was engaged, happy, and that should have been enough. But even as I washed the lipstick from my wine glass and folded my shawl over the chair, something in Chloe's smile lingered. It wasn't cruel, not exactly just practiced, as though she'd already decided what parts of me belonged in their new life and what parts didn't. The following weeks moved quickly. There were phone calls, text messages, Pinterest boards, and endless talk about colors and floral arrangements. At first, I tried to stay involved without hovering. I offered to help, to contribute, to listen. I even bought a new notebook, the kind with gold trim, thinking I might jot down ideas for them. But the next time I called Daniel to ask how the planning was going, he laughed. "You'll love the planner, Mom," he said. Chloe found someone amazing. Amy Carter. She's a professional. I tried to sound cheerful. "That's wonderful, dear. Will she be coordinating with me too?" He hesitated. "I think she's just working with us directly. You know how Chloe is. She wants everything organized." I bit back the small sting of disappointment. "Of course," I said softly. "Every bride deserves her perfect day." A few days later, Chloe called. Her tone was brisk, but polite. "Hi, Grace. I just wanted to let you know Amy's handling everything now. She's incredible. She did the Langford wedding last year. I'd seen the Langford wedding in the paper. It had looked like something from a movie, White Roses, spilling over marble railings, a string quartet doves." I smiled into the phone. "That sounds lovely." "It will be Chloe," said her voice smooth as silk. "We just want to make sure it's our day, not a family reunion, you know." I froze for half a second, unsure if she realized how that sounded. "Of course," I said, finally choosing kindness over pride. "I completely understand." "Great," she said, already moving on. "Amy will send you the save-the-date information soon. Oh, and thank you again for dinner that night. It was so sweet of you." Her voice softened slightly on that last line, and for a brief moment, I heard sincerity. Then she was gone. The next week, Amy reached out. Her email was bright and professional, full of enthusiasm and bullet points about venues and catering options. "It's such a joy working with Chloe and Daniel," she wrote. "They have an elegant vision, modern, timeless, elevated." I smiled faintly at the word elegant. It was a word Chloe used often, as if it excused the distance in her eyes. I replied with a short message, offering to help, however I could. A few days later, Amy invited me to a planning meeting at a cafe downtown. I arrived early, nervous but hopeful. When they walked in, Chloe in a cream blazer, Daniel beside her, Amy trailing with a tablet, I felt a rush of pride. My son looked radiant. But within 10 minutes, it became clear I was a guest, not a participant. Amy began listing venues, oceanfront resorts, historic mansions, vineyards with stone archways. "I was thinking," I said quietly, "there's that old chapel by the lake, the one with the oak trees and stained glass windows. It's small, but it's beautiful." Chloe smiled, the kind of smile that closes a door. "That's very sweet, Grace, but we're hoping for something a little more elegant." She drew out the last word delicately, as though it were a ribbon she was tying around her own dream. Daniel nodded quickly, not meeting my eyes. "Yeah, Chloe really wants the wow factor." I took a sip of water to steady myself. "Of course," I said. "Every couple deserves a day that feels like them." For the rest of the meeting, I listened. They spoke in a rhythm that didn't include me guest lists, lighting plans, themes. Amy smiled at me kindly once or twice, but even she seemed to understand. Her loyalty was elsewhere. When it ended, Chloe hugged me briefly, perfumed and distant. "Thank you for coming," she said. "This means a lot." That night, I went home to an inbox full of messages, promotions, newsletters, and one from Amy. I clicked it open without thinking. It was short, formal, and filled with logistical details. But one line caught my eye. "Venue deposit received gift payment under couple's account." Gift payment. My brows furrowed. I hadn't sent any money. I scrolled down and saw the receipt attach the payment made under my name from a check I'd written weeks earlier as a contribution for the engagement dinner. Somehow it had been redirected. I frowned, rereading the line again and again. Then my eyes moved to the bottom of the message where the venue name was listed. When I saw it, my hand began to tremble so badly I had to set down my tea. The name glowed on the screen like something pulled from another life. It was the place I had once dreamed of for my own wedding decades ago, before life took a different turn. The venue's name made my hands tremble. It was the one I once dreamed of for my own wedding. For a long moment, I just sat there at the kitchen table staring at the glowing letters on the screen. The Mariners' Hall. I hadn't thought of that place in decades. I'd passed by it once as a young woman standing across the street in a second-hand dress, watching another bride step through its tall white doors. I remember telling myself someday. But life had other plans, and I married James in the town chapel instead. It had been enough. More than enough, really, but now seeing that name again, it felt as though some forgotten part of me had stirred. I closed the laptop and sat back, letting the quiet fill the house. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly that twisted in my chest. It was something gentler and more painful, a wish that I could give Daniel everything I never had. He deserved that. He'd worked hard, lived kindly. If this was his dream, if this was Chloe's dream, I wanted to help make it real. The next morning, I called Amy. She sounded surprised to hear from me. "Mrs. Whitman, how are you?" she asked, her voice bright but careful. "Please call me Grace," I said. "Listen, I was wondering about the payment for the venue." She hesitated. "Yes, I received that deposit. Everything's confirmed." "I know," I said softly. "But I'd like to cover the remaining balance as well, quietly, if possible. Consider it a gift. For Daniel." There was a small pause, the kind that feels like someone deciding whether or not to argue. "That's incredibly generous of you," she said finally. "But are you sure it's quite a bit of money?" "I'm sure," I said. "Just make sure it's listed under their account. I don't want Chloe or Daniel to know, not now at least." When I hung up, I stared at the checkbook on the counter. The number I wrote was larger than anything I'd spent in years. It would mean dipping into my savings, but I didn't hesitate. I signed my name carefully, folded the check into an envelope, and sent it that afternoon. I felt a strange peace afterward, as if I'd quietly placed a brick in the foundation of something beautiful. A week later, I met Daniel and Chloe for lunch at a cafe near the waterfront. It was a crisp, sunny afternoon, and the place buzzed with young couples and families. Chloe looked radiant, all cream-colored silk and gold jewelry, her hair caught perfectly by the light. "You won't believe how much work wedding planning is," she said with a laugh. "I think I've answered 50 emails this morning. That's part of the fun, isn't it?" I said gently. "Oh, it's worth it," she replied. "The Mariners' Hall is absolutely perfect. My parents covered most of it, they insisted. They always do for big occasions." I smiled, though my fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "That's very kind of them," I said. "They must be so proud." Chloe waved her hand dismissively. "They don't like to talk about money, but they've always wanted my day to be special. They'll take care of everything." Daniel nodded, clearly proud of her confidence. "They've been amazing," he added. "I couldn't have done any of this without them." I didn't say a word. My throat tightened, but I swallowed it down with a sip of water. I reminded myself that it wasn't about credit or gratitude. It was about love. Sometimes, love means stepping back so others can shine. Still, as I watched Chloe gesture gracefully to the waiter, laughing softly, I felt an odd chill of understanding. She didn't just want the wedding to be perfect, she wanted it to be hers, unshared, untouched by anyone else's fingerprints. Amy called me later that evening. Her tone was friendly, but tentative. "Everything went through perfectly," she said. "The payment cleared. And Grace, thank you for your generosity. I know you didn't do it for recognition, but it really made a difference." "I'm just glad it's settled," I said. "How's Chloe handling everything?" Amy laughed softly, though it didn't sound entirely amused. "She's handling it all right. She has a very clear vision." "That sounds about right," I replied. We said our goodnights, and I went about cleaning up after dinner. The house felt especially quiet that night. I turned on the radio, an old habit when silence felt too heavy. I was just settling into my chair when the phone rang again. I almost didn't answer, thinking it might be another telemarketer. But it was Amy, her voice quick and breathless. "I'm sorry to bother you again," she said. "I just thought you should know. Chloe emailed me an hour ago." I frowned. "Is something wrong?" "Not exactly," Amy said. "She just doubled the guest list, Mrs. Whitman." Those words from Amy lingered long after the call ended. I sat there in the dim light of my kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I stared at the phone in my hand, wondering if Amy realized what she'd just told me, that Chloe hadn't just added names to a list. She'd added another wall between us. Over the next few weeks, planning became a full-time performance. Photos of centerpieces and floral arrangements flooded my inbox, though none of them came from Chloe. Everything I heard came secondhand from Daniel, from Amy, from snippets of conversation overheard when Daniel stopped by after work. "She's amazing, Mom," he'd say, his eyes shining. "You should see what she's pulled together. It's going to be elegant, like something out of a magazine." I'd nod and smile, careful not to let the ache show. "That sounds wonderful, dear. I'm so proud of you both." I tried to stay in the background the way good mothers do when their children start their own lives. I sent small gifts, cake samples, monogrammed napkins, silly things that made me feel included. None were ever acknowledged, but I told myself that was normal. Weddings are busy. People forget to say thank you when they're overwhelmed. I believed that until Amy called again. "Grace," she began gently, "I wanted to let you know we've made a few updates to the seating chart, just some logistical adjustments." Her voice had that careful tone people use when they're about to hurt you without meaning to. "Adjustments?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Yes." Chloe wanted to make sure her parents' friends were closer to the front. There wasn't quite enough space up front for everyone, so "You'll be seated in row D." I paused. "Row D. That's near the back," she admitted quickly. "But you'll still have a great view of the ceremony." I looked around my quiet kitchen at the worn table where Daniel once did his homework, at the window I used to watch him play catch in the yard. "Row D," I repeated softly, like I was tasting the words. "That's fine, Amy. Whatever works best for them." "You're very kind," she said. "I'm so sorry Chloe just has a specific vision." I forced a small laugh. "Oh, she always does." When we hung up, I sat very still. The clock ticked loudly in the next room. It wasn't about the seat, not really. It was about what it meant to be moved quietly out of sight, to be made small on a day that should have been shared. But I swallowed it down. Maybe this was what mothers were meant to do, to step aside, to make room for new families to begin. A few days later, Amy emailed again. Her tone was apologetic, almost hesitant. "Grace," it read, "Chloe has decided to limit the number of people included in the pre-wedding photos. I wanted to let you know so there's no confusion. It'll just be immediate family, her parents, siblings, the bridal party." I blinked at the screen, reading the message twice. Immediate family. The phrase burned quietly in my chest. I typed a short reply. "Thank you for letting me know. Wishing everyone the best," and hit send before I could think better of it. That night, Daniel called. "Mom," he began carefully, I heard Amy spoke to you about the photos. Yes, I said lightly. She mentioned it. That's fine. He hesitated. Chloe just thought it might be too hectic. She didn't want you to feel overwhelmed. Overwhelmed? I almost laughed. Darling, I taught 32nd graders for 20 years. I think I can handle a camera. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he said, She just wants everything perfect, Mom. Please understand. Of course, I said, quietly. I always do. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine I didn't really want. I sat by the window watching the moonlight spill over the garden. The roses had started to wilt. I'd forgotten to water them again. The house felt smaller these days, as if every new decision Chloe made took another inch of space from me. Then late one evening, my phone buzzed. A text from Chloe. The screen lit up with her name, neat and confident. For a moment, I considered not opening it. But I did. The message was short. Grace, we've decided it's best if you don't attend the wedding. This is our day, and we just want to keep things simple. I hope you understand. I read it once. Then again. My hands went cold. I didn't cry, not right away. Instead, I just sat there staring at the words, trying to find some reason, some kindness hidden between the lines. There was none. I wanted to call Daniel to ask if he knew, but I already knew the answer. He'd find out later, after it was too late to stop it. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed up sewing costumes for school plays, about the mornings I'd packed lunches and left notes in his backpack. I thought about the check I'd sent the money that now sat under their names. Then I thought about my garden and how sometimes you have to let certain flowers go to seed, no matter how much you love them. I stared at the glowing message a moment longer, then pressed delete. The screen went black, leaving only my reflection staring back at me. I deleted it, and my silence felt heavier than any reply could ever be. For a long time, I just sat there in the glow of the phone screen, staring at the reflection of my own face in the black glass. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes when someone shuts you out completely. It doesn't roar or crash. It just settles, thick and still like dust in a room that's been sealed for years. The next morning, I woke up early, though I hadn't really slept. The house felt unfamiliar, as if someone had taken something vital out of it. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the sun crawl over the garden. The roses were nearly gone now, the petals falling one by one. I thought of the wedding that would soon happen without me. The laughter, the music, my son's smile, and tried to imagine where I would have fit in. Somewhere in row D, I supposed, or maybe nowhere at all. By mid-morning, Helen stopped by. She was my neighbor, my friend, the kind of woman who could sense heartache the way some people can smell rain. She brought a basket of muffins, pretending it was just a casual visit, but her eyes softened when she saw me. "You got my message?" she asked gently. "I heard from Mabel, the florist in town. She's doing the Sanders-Whitman wedding this weekend." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, I heard." She hesitated, then said the question I knew was coming. "Will you still go?" For a moment, I couldn't answer. The question sat between us, heavy and awkward. I picked up my cup, tracing the rim with my finger before finally saying, "I'll send flowers." Helen watched me closely. "You're a better woman than I'd be." I gave a small smile. "I don't know about that." I turned to look outside again, where the wind had caught a few loose petals from the rosebush. Sometimes sending flowers is easier than showing up to watch your place taken. She sighed, coming to stand beside me. "You shouldn't have to be so gracious all the time, Grace." "Maybe not," I said, "but it's what people expect of women like me." We give quietly. It's the only way we know. Helen reached out and touched my arm. You don't deserve this. I didn't reply. What could I say? Deserve didn't seem to matter anymore. After she left, I wandered through the house, dusting shelves that didn't need dusting, folding towels that were already neat. The emptiness hummed around me, too full of memories. By late afternoon, I heard the sound of tires on gravel and glanced through the window. Daniel's car. My heart leapt and sank all at once. He stepped out slowly, his jacket slung over one shoulder, his face drawn and tired. When I opened the door, he didn't smile right away. Hey, Mom? He said almost in a whisper. Hey, I answered softly. You look tired. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. It's been a lot. He followed me into the kitchen, sitting at the same table where I'd raised him on stories and soup. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he said, Chloe told me she texted you. I nodded. She did. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. She just wants a peaceful day, Mom. You know how things can get complicated. She's stressed and peaceful, I interrupted gently. He hesitated, lowering his eyes. Yeah. She thinks it'll be easier without extra tension. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Daniel, I said quietly. Peace shouldn't come from pushing people away. He looked up, then guilt flickering across his face. I know. I told her it wasn't right. I did. But she's under pressure. Her parents, the guests, the planner. I watched him stumble over excuses, his voice growing smaller with each one. He looked so much like the boy I used to patch up after schoolyard fights, ashamed, but trying to justify why he didn't swing back. She's your wife-to-be, I said. I understand that. You need to stand by her. I just wish it didn't have to be like this, he murmured. So do I. Silence stretched between us again. The clock ticked steadily above the stove, marking every second that neither of us could fix. Finally, he stood. I'll make it up to you, I promise. I smiled, though it felt like paper-thin glass. Just be happy, Daniel. That's all I've ever wanted. He leaned down to kiss my cheek. His lips were warm, but his eyes carried that same look I'd seen at dinner, the one that begged me not to make things harder. I love you, Mom, he said softly. I love you too. After he left, I stood by the window watching his car disappear down the road. The gravel settled back into silence, and the sound of the engine faded. For a long time, I just stood there, my hand resting on the curtain, my heart thudding in a rhythm I couldn't calm. When he left, the house sounded like it did the day his father died, too quiet to be peaceful. That kind of silence doesn't rest. It lingers, restless and sharp, as if waiting for you to do something about it. I spent the next 2 days moving through that quiet like a ghost, keeping my hands busy with small tasks that didn't matter. I told myself I was done, that I would let the wedding happen without me, that sometimes the most graceful thing a person can do is to stay away. But hearts rarely obey logic. They just keep reaching for what they've already lost. It was the morning before the wedding when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer, thinking it might be a wrong number, but then I saw the name Amy Carter. Her voice came through the line, bright but tentative. Grace, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Not at all, I said, though my voice betrayed the fatigue I'd been carrying. Is everything all right? She hesitated. Everything's fine. Well, we could use an extra pair of hands tomorrow morning. There are so many gifts and decorations to move from the delivery truck to the venue. I thought of you. I froze, unsure what to say. Amy, I said slowly, I don't think Chloe would want me there. There was a pause, then Amy replied gently, You'd just be helping behind the scenes. No one would mind. Her tone softened. And if it were me, I'd want my mother there, even if no one else did. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the half-drunk cup of tea in front of me. My reflection in the glass looked tired, older than I remembered, but there was something steady in my eyes, a quiet resolve. "All right," I said finally. "I'll come." That night I laid out a pale blue dress I hadn't worn in years. It wasn't new or fashionable, but it was simple and soft, the color of clear morning light. I pressed the wrinkles out by hand and pinned a small white rose to the neckline. I didn't tell anyone I was going, not Daniel, not Helen. Some things are easier when they belong only to you. The next morning I drove to the venue early. The Mariners' Hall was even more breathtaking than I'd imagined. The building shimmered with white stone and glass overlooking the sea. A breeze carried the faint scent of salt and flowers. For a moment I just stood there taking it all in. Somewhere deep down, the girl I used to be, the one who once dreamed of walking through those doors, felt seen. Amy met me by the service entrance, clipboard in hand, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She smiled when she saw me. "You look lovely," she said softly. "Thank you for coming." "It's no trouble," I said. "I'm just here to help." She nodded, but her eyes held something else, something kind, almost conspiratorial. Together, we carried boxes of wrapped gifts into the reception hall, the sound of laughter and last-minute instructions echoing from inside. By noon, guests had begun to arrive. Cars lined the circular drive doors opening to reveal women in pastel dresses and men in crisp suits. I lingered near the back, pretending to busy myself with the gift table. But my gaze kept finding Daniel. He looked nervous, but happy, handsome in his navy suit. When Chloe appeared at his side, radiant in her gown, I felt a pang so strong it almost took my breath. She was beautiful, that much I couldn't deny. The dress shimmered like light on water, her smile perfect and practiced. I wondered if she'd even notice me. I found a seat in the last row far enough back that no one turned when I sat down. The ceremony space was filled with music and the low hum of voices. I folded my hands in my lap and kept my eyes on Daniel, letting every other sound fade. There was no anger in me then, only something quieter, a wish that love, in whatever form it took, would find its way back to him someday. As the ceremony began, Amy moved gracefully between the rows, coordinating with staff, whispering cues to the musicians. I caught her glance once, and she gave me a small, reassuring smile. I nodded, grateful for the unspoken kindness. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw Chloe turn. Her expression froze for half a second when she spotted me. She leaned toward Amy, her voice a sharp whisper I couldn't quite hear, but I knew. A moment later, Chloe's voice carried just enough for the nearest row to notice she wasn't invited. Amy didn't flinch. She simply smiled, the calm, practiced kind of smile that holds power. I saw her lean slightly closer to Chloe, her lips barely moving as she whispered back, "Everyone deserves to witness love." The music swelled again, covering whatever else might have been said. Chloe straightened her smile, returning, but her hands fidgeted with the edge of her bouquet. Daniel didn't notice. He was focused on the officiant, his eyes soft and full of hope. From where I sat, the sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching in the pale blue of my dress. The world seemed suspended, one part heartbreak, one part grace. For the first time in weeks, I felt no shame in being there. I belonged, if only as a silent witness, to the day I had quietly helped build. And then Amy walked toward the microphone. I watched her move across the stage with that calm, purposeful grace. She always carried her clipboard, now replaced by a small, folded note. The ceremony had ended barely 10 minutes ago. Guests were filing into the reception hall, laughing glasses, clinking music swelling through the room like a tide of celebration. The air shimmered with perfume and champagne, with the kind of joy that feels too loud to be real. From my seat in the back, I could see everything: the dance floor polished like glass, the soft white lights strung along the rafters, the way Daniel looked at Chloe as if she were the only person left in the world. It should have been beautiful, and it was. But beneath that beauty, there was something fragile, trembling like a ribbon pulled too tight. Amy tapped the microphone gently, and the sound carried across the hall. The chatter softened. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice bright professional. "Before we continue the festivities, we'd like to take a moment to express our gratitude." At the head table, Chloe turned slightly toward her parents, her smile glowing under the warm light. She looked every bit the perfect bride, composed, radiant, untouchable. Her hand rested on Daniel's arm, fingers perfectly poised, as if she'd practiced that gesture 100 times. I could almost see the script in her head. This would be the moment they thanked her family, the moment she basked in the acknowledgement she'd been waiting for. Amy continued, her tone softening. "Every wedding is a story," she said. "And this one, as you can see, has been a beautiful one. The flowers, the setting, the music, it all came together because of one act of incredible generosity." Chloe's smile widened, confident now. Her mother reached for her hand under the table. I saw it clearly from where I sat: the small, satisfied nod, the readiness to receive the praise that would surely follow. Around them, guests turned expectantly toward the front, murmuring. Even Daniel smiled, unaware of what was coming. Amy unfolded the note in her hand. "We would like to thank the person," she said, pausing for just a heartbeat, "who made this beautiful day possible." The room went still for a moment, waiting for the name. Chloe tilted her head slightly, her expression glowing with anticipation. I could feel the hush ripple through the guests like wind through tall grass. Amy looked up from the paper and smiled, not at the couple, but at me. Our eyes met across the room, and in that instant, I understood what she was about to do. "Grace Whitman," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the speakers the groom's mother. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. It was as if time itself had tripped. Then came the soft sound of gasps, the flicker of camera flashes, the low murmur of confusion spreading through the hall. Heads turned toward me. I didn't move. I just sat there, my hands folded in my lap, the pale blue fabric of my dress catching the light. At the head table, Chloe's smile froze, mid-curve, her lips parting slightly, but no sound coming out. Her mother's hand dropped from hers. Daniel's eyes widened confusion, replacing the easy joy he'd worn all evening. Amy lowered the microphone slightly, her face calm, professional, as though she hadn't just tilted the entire room off its axis. A photographer, unaware of the tension, snapped a picture. Chloe's face caught in that perfect, terrible second between composure and collapse. The flash went off bright and sharp, reflecting against the crystal glasses. Amy went on, her tone steady. This day, this venue, this celebration, none of it would have been possible without the quiet kindness of Mrs. Whitman, whose gift made it all come true. Some gestures don't need to be seen to be felt. But today, we want to honor that generosity. I felt the sting of tears, though I didn't let them fall. I hadn't come for revenge. I'd come to see my son smile. But as I watched Chloe sitting there rigid and silent, her perfect world beginning to crack under the weight of truth, I realized that sometimes justice doesn't need anger, it only needs light. Applause began, hesitant at first. A few guests clapped politely, unsure if they should. Then Daniel stood, his eyes fixed on me. He clapped slowly, deliberately, and the sound spread. One by one, others followed until the hall filled with the echo of hands, meeting hands, a rhythm that sounded almost like forgiveness. Chloe didn't move. Her face was pale now, her smile gone. She looked at me across the room, her expression unreadable, shock, disbelief, and something else beneath it, something raw and frightened. The music resumed quietly in the background, a soft piano melody that suddenly felt too gentle for the moment. Amy set the microphone down and gave me a small nod, almost invisible to anyone else. Around her, the staff moved on, refilling glasses, rearranging flowers, pretending not to notice the fracture that had just opened in the center of the room. I stayed seated, letting the applause fade into murmurs, the murmurs into whispers. Daniel was still looking at me, torn between pride and confusion. Chloe turned away, her shoulders stiff, her hand gripping her napkin until her knuckles turned white. The lights glowed warm across the tables, the scent of roses heavy in the air. The celebration continued, but something essential had changed, something everyone could feel, but no one dared name. For the first time that day, her silence was louder than the music. The sound of applause faded into a low, uneasy hum that seemed to press against the walls of the hall. I sat still watching as Chloe's expression hardened into something brittle and unfamiliar. The smile she'd worn so effortlessly all afternoon had vanished, leaving behind a mask of quiet panic. Around her, guests shifted uncomfortably, the atmosphere charged with confusion. No one quite knew what to say or do. Amy was already moving on to the next part of the program, her voice steady and bright, as if nothing unusual had happened. The music resumed, glasses clinked, waiters circulated again, but the celebration had lost its rhythm. Every conversation that followed carried an awkwardness, a hesitation, as though people feared their words might echo too loudly in the new silence. I stayed where I was in the back row, my heart oddly calm. I hadn't come to ruin anything. I hadn't even known Amy planned to say my name. Yet as I sat there watching Chloe's composure unravel thread by thread, I realized that some truths, once spoken, don't destroy, they simply reveal what was already broken. From across the room, I saw Daniel lean toward Chloe, whispering something urgent. Her eyes flashed, and she shook her head sharply. Then, without warning, she stood. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing glances from nearby tables. She grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him toward the exit. He stumbled slightly, caught off guard. "Chloe, wait!" he started, but she was already pushing through the crowd. The music faltered as heads turned. I could hear fragments of her voice low, clipped, trembling with fury. "You let her humiliate me!" She hissed, her words cutting through the chatter. In front of everyone, Daniel tried to calm her, his hands raised in quiet pleading. "Chloe, stop. Please, you're making a scene." "I'm making a scene," she snapped, her face flushed. She sat there like a saint while Amy announced to the world that your mother bought our wedding. Do you have any idea how that makes me look? I couldn't hear his reply, but I saw the way he exhaled long and slow, the way a man does when he's realizing something he doesn't want to admit. They disappeared through the side door, leaving a wake of murmurs behind them. Amy approached me, then her expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said quietly, but she needed to know the truth wasn't hers to control. I looked up at her, unsure what to say. Part of me wanted to thank her. Another part felt the strange ache of having my private act of kindness turned into something public. "You did what you thought was right," I said finally. "And maybe it was." She hesitated. "You should know Grace Daniel didn't know either. He never saw the payment details. He thought it came from her parents." "I know," I said softly. "He'll figure it out soon enough." Amy gave a small nod and walked away to manage the guests, leaving me alone again. I watched as people avoided looking directly at me or at the empty chairs where the bride and groom had been sitting. It's funny how people do that pretend not to notice the most obvious thing in the room, as though silence can erase what's just been seen. Outside the tall glass windows, the afternoon light had shifted. The sky was turning the color of pale honey, the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it really is. I rose quietly, smoothing the skirt of my dress, and gathered my purse. No one stopped me as I slipped out through the back door. The sound of laughter had dimmed, replaced by the muted clatter of dishes and the rustle of whispered speculation. I stepped into the courtyard, where a gentle breeze carried the scent of salt and roses. The ocean shimmered in the distance, calm and endless. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing it in the air, the quiet, the peace that came when there was nothing left to say. From the corner of the building, I heard voices again. Chloe's sharp, brittle tone broke through the hush. "I can't believe you're defending her." "I'm not defending anyone," Daniel replied, his voice strained but steady. "I'm trying to understand why you lied. You told everyone your parents paid for the wedding. They were going to," she shot back. "But then your mother stuck her nose in. She's been trying to control everything from the start." "She didn't control anything," Daniel said quietly. "She helped. You just didn't want anyone to know. I didn't move. I didn't want them to see me. Didn't want to hear any more than I already had." But his next words carried clear and low straight into the open air. "You know, Chloe, Mom didn't say a word. Amy did. That's the difference between you and her. You hide things to look perfect. She hides things to protect people." There was a long pause. Then Chloe's voice, small now. "So what, you're taking her side?" "I'm taking the side that isn't built on lies," he said. I turned then, walking away before I could hear the rest. Some truths are better left unfinished. When I reached my car, I looked back once more. Through the glass doors, I could see people shifting awkwardly at their tables. The laughter forced the joy thinned out. Chloe had returned to her seat, her face pale and tight. Guests spoke to her with careful smiles, but their eyes gave her no comfort. Daniel stood apart, speaking with Amy, his shoulders heavy with the weight of something newly understood. I got into my car and started the engine, the hum of it grounding me. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated or even sad. I just felt quiet, peaceful, in a way that no invitation could have offered. As I drove away, the wedding hall grew smaller in the rearview mirror, a glowing shell filled with music that no longer reached me. The road stretched ahead, the horizon open and forgiving. Sometimes silence wins arguments. Words never could. That thought stayed with me for days after the wedding, echoing in the quiet corners of my house. I didn't call Daniel, and he didn't call me. The silence between us wasn't angry. It was weary, full of things neither of us knew how to say. I told myself I would give him space to untangle the mess that had been made of what should have been a happy beginning. I kept busy with my garden, with small chores that made time move even when my heart wanted to stop and listen for his voice. A week passed before I finally heard from him. His call came late at night after the house had gone still. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice hoarse, tired. "Can I come by tomorrow?" Of course I said, though I already knew something was broken. When he arrived the next morning, he looked older somehow. The boyish ease that used to light his face was gone, replaced by the dull shadow of sleepless nights. He didn't take off his jacket. He just stood in the doorway for a long moment, as if unsure he was allowed in. "How are you?" I asked quietly. He exhaled through his nose, a sound somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "That's a big question." I motioned to the table. "Coffee." He nodded. We sat across from each other like two people waiting for a storm to pass. Finally, he said, "We've been fighting. A lot. About everything." I didn't ask what everything meant. Some wounds speak for themselves. She's upset about the wedding, I ventured. She's upset about being embarrassed, he said, rubbing his temples. She keeps saying I should have protected her, that I should have stopped Amy. And what do you think I asked? He hesitated. I think she's more upset about losing control than being hurt. He shook his head, eyes distant. She's been calling Amy nonstop, trying to make her retract the statement. And Amy, well, she finally stopped answering. I stirred my coffee, pretending to focus on the sound of the spoon against the cup. And I'm just tired, he said. Every conversation turns into a fight. She keeps saying I'm taking your side, that I'm letting you win. I looked at him, then really looked, and saw how much that sentence cost him. Daniel, I said gently, this isn't about sides. I know he said, but she doesn't. She can't see past what people think of her. It's like she's fighting a war that only exists in her head. For a while, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked softly behind us. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. Amy sent me this, he said. I took it from him, my fingers brushing his. Inside was a printed contract, a payment agreement from the Mariners' Hall signed by Amy Carter, and stamped with the date. My own name was there at the bottom, next to the bank's imprint. There it was in black and white, the truth that had quietly kept their dream afloat. She said she thought I should know, Daniel murmured. She thought I already did. I folded the paper carefully, setting it on the table. I never meant for you to find out this way. He leaned back in his chair, staring at nothing. You shouldn't have had to pay for any of it, he said. It was supposed to be our wedding, but I didn't even know who paid for my own vows. I didn't do it for recognition, I said softly. I did it because you're my son, and because I wanted you to have a beautiful day, no matter what happened to me. He closed his eyes for a long moment, his jaw tightening. I know, Mom, and that's what makes it worse. When he left, I didn't ask where he was going, but I had a feeling. Later that afternoon, the rain started. It came hard and fast, drumming against the roof in steady rhythm. I made dinner, though I wasn't hungry. I was just cleaning up when I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to the window. It was Daniel. He stepped out of the car carrying a duffel bag. His hair was damp, his expression calm in the way people get when they've already cried all they can. I met him at the door. She knows you're here, I asked quietly. He nodded once. We fought again. She said I embarrassed her twice, once by being born into the wrong family, and again by not standing up to you. I didn't say anything. I just packed my things. Daniel, I whispered. I'm so sorry. Don't be, he said. I think I finally see her for who she is. I just wish it didn't take this long. He brushed past me gently, carrying his bag down the hall. I watched him disappear into his old room, the same room with the posters still tacked crooked on the wall, the same bed I used to sit beside when he was sick as a boy. I heard the creak of the mattress, the soft rustle of the covers. I turned off the lights in the living room and stood for a moment in the doorway listening. The rain eased outside, leaving behind only the soft dripping from the eaves. In the quiet, I could hear him breathing slow, steady, safe. For the first time in a long time, my house didn't feel empty. But the comfort of that thought came mixed with sadness. Life has a way of circling back to where it began, even when you pray it won't. That night, he slept in his old room as if time had never moved. I stood by the door for a while, watching the slow rhythm of his breathing through the faint crack of light from the hallway. There was something both comforting and heartbreaking about it. My son had come home, yes, but not as a boy returning from college or a man visiting his mother. He had come home as someone who'd finally run out of strength, The next morning, Daniel sat at the kitchen table in his t-shirt, holding a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. He looked hollowed out, as if the life had drained from him overnight. "She hasn't called," he said quietly. "Not once." "She will," I replied. "People like Chloe don't disappear, they regroup." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "You always did see people too clearly." He pushed his cup away, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mom, I don't think this can be fixed." I didn't argue. Some things aren't meant to be patched together. Some things are meant to fall apart so you can finally see what they were made of. 3 days later, the story broke. I was in the living room folding laundry when my phone started buzzing on the counter. Helen's name flashed across the screen. "Grace," she said, the moment I answered her voice a mix of shock and fascination. "Have you seen it?" "Seen what?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "The paper," she said. "Page 2 of the Chronicle, and it's already all over Facebook." I opened my laptop, my hands trembling slightly. There it was, a headline that seemed too cruel and too true all at once. "Bride bans groom's mother from wedding after using her money to pay for it." The article recounted every detail with merciless precision. The lavish ceremony, the whispers among guests, the planner's revelation of the anonymous donor. There were photos too, one of Chloe mid-smile caught just before it froze, and another of me sitting quietly in the back row, my blue dress glowing under the soft light. Someone online had captioned it "The Mother Who Gave Everything." By noon, the story had gone viral. Local news stations were running it under headlines like "A Wedding to Forget" and "Love's Most Awkward Day." Comment sections filled with strangers taking sides, but most weren't kind to Chloe. Words like spoiled, heartless, and ungrateful appeared over and over again. Daniel didn't want to read it, but he didn't have to. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from coworkers, friends, people asking if it was true. He silenced it and sat beside me, staring at the muted TV. "She'll never recover from this," he said quietly. I wanted to tell him that recovery is always possible, but I didn't. Deep down, I knew this wasn't a wound time could heal. It was one built on pride, and pride doesn't mend. It just crumbles. By the end of the week, Chloe's world had begun to collapse. Her marketing firm issued a polite but public statement about reputation concerns and ethical conduct. In plain words, they fired her. Friends stopped responding to her texts. The social circles she'd once ruled over with champagne smiles and curated photos now turned cold, pretending not to see her at brunches or parties. Even her mother, always so elegant, always so concerned with appearances, was photographed leaving a restaurant, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. The caption read, "Mother of infamous bride refuses comment." For a while, I told myself I wouldn't feel anything, that I wouldn't take any satisfaction in her fall. But when Daniel showed me the screenshots, when I saw her name trending next to words like cruelty and betrayal, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. The kind of tired that comes after you've been right for too long. Then one night, near midnight, the phone rang again. I almost didn't answer, but something in me knew who it was before I even picked up. Grace. Her voice was small, shaky, so different I barely recognized it. "Yes," I said softly. There was a pause, then a sound that wasn't quite a sob, but close. "I didn't know who else to call," she whispered. "Everyone's gone. My friends won't talk to me, my parents," her voice cracked. "They said I embarrassed them. They don't even want to be seen with me." I listened silent, letting her words spill into the dark. "I don't have anyone left," she said, finally the words breaking apart. "Not even Daniel." I closed my eyes. The house was so still that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the old clock on the wall. "That's what pride does, dear," I said gently. "It leaves you alone." There was a soft gasp on the other end of the line, the sound of someone realizing too late that the floor beneath them has given way. She didn't argue. For once, she didn't try to explain or defend herself. She just breathed shallow, uneven, lost. "I'm sorry," she whispered finally. "For everything. I know I said. And I hope someday you'll be sorry for yourself too. Not for what happened to you, but for what you did to make it happen." She didn't answer right away. I could hear her crying quietly, like someone trying to hold the sound back and failing. There was nothing cruel in me in that moment, only a strange, distant ache, the kind that comes from watching something burn that you once tried to save. When she spoke again, her voice was a ghost of itself. "Do you hate me?" "No," I said truthfully. "Hate's easy. You don't deserve that kind of effort." The silence that followed was long and heavy, but it wasn't the same silence that had filled me before. This one belonged to her. It was the silence of someone facing the echo of their own choices. "Goodbye, Grace," she whispered. "Goodbye, Chloe," I said softly, and the line went dead. I stood there for a moment, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the hollow click of disconnection. Then I placed the phone back in its cradle and turned off the light. Outside, the wind was rising, bending the trees, rattling the windows like the world itself was exhaling at last. And that was the last time I heard her voice trembling, not demanding. The days that followed settled into a kind of quiet rhythm. Daniel started looking for a new apartment, and the house slowly began to feel less like a place where something had been broken and more like somewhere life might begin again. The headlines faded, the online noise dulled, and the world moved on the way it always does, forgetting faster than it forgives. Months passed. The leaves changed, the air sharpened, and I went back to the small routines that had once filled my life: morning walks, grocery runs, tending the last stubborn roses before winter came. Daniel visited often, though we rarely spoke about Chloe. There was still a faint sadness in his eyes when her name came up, but it was softer now, worn down by time. I think some part of him still cared for her, but love, like everything else, can lose its shape when stretched too far. One afternoon, I stopped by the grocery store on my way home from the post office. It was a gray day, the kind that makes everything feel slower, quieter. The aisles were half empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above me. I was comparing prices on canned soup when I heard a familiar voice at the register, a voice I hadn't expected to hear again. "Can you just give me a second?" the woman was saying. Her tone wasn't sharp this time, it was weary frayed. "I have enough, just let me count." I turned, and there she was. Chloe. She stood at the counter, her shoulders slumped, her once glossy hair tied back in a loose braid. Her coat was too thin for the season, and her eyes, those bright, calculating eyes I remembered, looked dull, ringed with exhaustion. On the counter sat a small pile of groceries: bread, milk, a few canned vegetables, and a single box of pasta. She was digging through her purse, pulling out handfuls of coins. The cashier, a teenage boy, shifted uncomfortably, his patience stretched but polite. "Take your time, ma'am," he said. Chloe's hands shook slightly as she laid the coins down one by one, lining them up in neat, desperate rows. The metallic clink of each one echoed through the quiet store. I should have turned away. I should have left her to her privacy. But something, pity, maybe, or a flicker of unfinished understanding, kept my feet rooted in place. She looked up then, and our eyes met. For a long second, she didn't move. Her face went pale, and the air between us tightened like a wire. I saw a dozen things flash across her expression. Shock, embarrassment, maybe even relief, but above all, shame. "Grace," she said finally, her voice small, uneven. I gave her a faint smile. "Hello, Chloe." She blinked rapidly, as if trying to decide whether to stand her ground or flee. "You must think this is funny," she said quietly, her tone brittle. "Seeing me like this." "No," I said softly. "I don't think it's funny." Her lips trembled. "You looked down on me, didn't you? From the very beginning. You thought I wasn't good enough for him." I took a step closer, keeping my voice calm. "No, Chloe. I didn't look down on you." She gave a bitter, hollow laugh. "Of course you did. You all did. His perfect mother sitting there judging me. You probably think I deserve this." I shook my head slowly. "No, Chloe. I looked at you. You just never looked back." She froze her eyes, darting to mine as if searching for anger and finding none. For the first time, she seemed truly lost, not defiant, not proud, just empty. The coins she'd been holding slipped from her hand, scattering across the counter with a soft chime. She didn't reach for them right away. The cashier cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Ma'am Chloe blinked, snapping out of it. She gathered the coins, quickly finishing the payment with trembling fingers. When the transaction was done, she picked up the small paper bag and stood there for a moment, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I didn't mean for it to go this way," she murmured almost to herself. "Most people don't," I said quietly. She looked at me again, her eyes glassy with tears she wouldn't let fall. For a heartbeat, I thought she might say something else, an apology maybe, or another defense, but she only nodded faintly, a gesture of defeat more than acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked toward the door. I watched her go, her figure small against the gray light outside. When the door swung shut behind her, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. There was no triumph in me, no satisfaction. Just a strange, gentle sadness, the kind that feels like both an ending and a release. The cashier gave me a tentative look. "Do you know her?" he asked. "Yes," I said softly. "I used to." He nodded uncertain and went back to scanning items for the next customer. I lingered for a moment longer, staring at the empty space where she'd stood. On the way out, I passed the window and saw her across the parking lot standing by a small dented car. She was wiping her face with the back of her sleeve, trying to compose herself before getting in. The sight of her made my heart ache, not because I missed her, but because I understood her. Pride had been her armor for so long that she didn't know how to live without it. When she finally drove away, I felt something inside me loosen. Something I hadn't known I was still holding on to. The resentment, the disappointment, the quiet, hurt it all began to drift away with the sound of her engine fading into the distance. Forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken. Sometimes it's just letting go. That thought stayed with me through the winter, through the slow melting of snow and the first green whispers of spring. The world moved on quietly, the way it always does after storms. Daniel found work with a small architecture firm in town, something steady and modest. He started smiling again, a little more each day, as if learning how. I watched from a distance, never pushing, just giving him the space to build a life that wasn't defined by what he'd lost. By the time a year had passed, the sharp edges of that old pain had softened into something else, something that felt almost like gratitude. Life had done what it always promised to it, had moved forward. I didn't hear from Chloe again. I didn't expect to. The last I knew, she'd moved back to her parents' town and was working part-time at a florist's shop. It seemed fitting somehow she'd once been surrounded by things that wilted when they were mishandled. Maybe she'd finally learned how to care for something delicate. Then one afternoon, Daniel came by. He was standing on my porch when I opened the door, the sunlight behind him. There was a gentleness in his expression I hadn't seen in years. "Can I come in?" he asked. "You never have to ask," I said, stepping aside. He sat at the table, hands clasped. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he said, his voice careful, but warm. "Her name's Emily. She's different." Different how I asked, smiling a little. He thought for a moment. "She listens," he said, "and she laughs easily. It's not complicated with her." I nodded, understanding more than I said. "That sounds nice." "It is," he said softly. Then after a pause, "We're getting married." For a second, I just stared at him, the words settling slowly like snow. Then I felt a warmth spread through me, the kind that begins in the heart and reaches all the way to the fingertips. "Oh, Daniel," I whispered, "I'm so happy for you." He smiled, relief flickering in his eyes. "It's going to be small. Just a few friends. Simple. I thought you'd like that." I laughed, though my throat tightened. "You thought right." The ceremony took place a month later in a small garden behind the old town library. There were no chandeliers, no designer dresses, no photographers. Just sunlight filtering through trees, a few rows of wooden chairs, and the soft hum of a violinist playing in the background. The air smelled faintly of lilac and fresh-cut grass. When I arrived, Emily came to greet me. She was radiant, in the kind of quiet way that doesn't draw attention to itself. Her smile was real, warm enough to dissolve every trace of old bitterness that might have lingered in me. She hugged me gently. "It means so much that you're here," she said. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied. They stood under an arch of white blossoms as they exchanged vows. Daniel's voice was steady, his hand firm around hers. There was no hesitation, no pretense. When he slid the ring onto her finger, I felt a rush of emotion I hadn't expected: pride, peace, and something deeper. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to protect him, to shield him from hurt, only to realize that sometimes pain is the only way we learn how to love honestly. As they finished their vows, the afternoon light shifted, turning everything gold. The guests clapped softly, and I found myself smiling without effort. My heart, for the first time in what felt like forever, felt light. I looked at them, my son and his new wife, and thought, this time, love looks honest. After the ceremony, we all gathered for cake and coffee at a nearby cafe. There was laughter, simple conversation, and the sound of music playing faintly from an old radio. No one talked about the past, and no one needed to. The future was enough. Later that evening, when the sun had begun to set, I walked home alone. The air was warm, the sky painted in streaks of pink and gold. My house waited quietly for me, its windows glowing with the soft light of early evening. I slipped off my shoes and went out to the garden. The soil was still damp from the morning rain. I knelt by the flower bed and began to plant a row of new daisies I'd bought earlier in the week. My hands sank into the earth, cool and familiar. Each stem I pressed into the ground felt like a small promise to keep growing, to keep forgiving, to keep loving, without needing anything back. When I finished, I sat back on my heels and looked around. The garden was quiet, except for the distant chirping of crickets. The last bit of sunlight brushed the tops of the flowers, making them look almost alive with color. I thought about everything that had led me here. The heartbreak, the silence, the revenge that had never really been about winning. It had been about truth. And now, standing there with dirt under my nails and peace in my heart, I understood that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just settles softly, like petals falling after a long bloom. Peace doesn't need witnesses, I whispered to the garden, to the earth, to myself. The wind stirred lightly, carrying the scent of fresh soil and new beginnings. I smiled, closing my eyes for a moment, letting it wash over me. For once, I didn't need anyone to see it. I just needed to feel it. And that's how it all came full circle. A mother's quiet strength, a son's second chance, and a love that finally learned the difference between appearances and truth. Grace's story wasn't about revenge. Not really, it was about dignity, patience, and the power of silence to speak louder than pride ever could. Sometimes justice doesn't come with shouting or grand gestures. Sometimes it's a soft moment in a garden, a small smile, a life that goes on better than before. If you've watched this far, I want to ask you something. What would you have done if you were in Grace's place? Would you have stayed silent the way she did, or would you have confronted everything head on? I'd love to know how you feel about her choice. Was it strength or heartbreak? Victory or peace? If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Stories about love, family betrayal, and the small moments that remind us who we are. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Your voice helps keep stories like this alive. Thank you for listening, for being part of this moment. And remember, sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest.